Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
The day everything shattered. The morning my marriage ended. I wasn't standing in a courtroom, or even in our living room. I was standing in the middle of a grocery store in suburban Ohio, holding a carton of milk I didn't know how to pay for because I suddenly couldn't remember the English word for cashier. And in that moment, surrounded by fluorescent lights and strangers speaking a language that felt like a wall between me and survival, I realized something far more terrifying than the divorce papers waiting on my kitchen counter. I realized I had built my entire American life on someone else's shoulders. His words, his translations, his confidence in ordering coffee, making phone calls, explaining to the landlord why the sink was leaking. And now he was gone. Actually, he had been gone for months emotionally. But the legal end came on a Thursday afternoon when I found myself incapable of asking a store clerk where to find the eggs. I stood there, frozen, a 38-year-old woman with 2 children, a degree from a respectable university in my home country, and absolutely no ability to function in the country I now called home. The divorce didn't just end my marriage. It ended my identity as a capable human being. It silenced me in a way that was so profound and so humiliating that I wanted to collapse right there between the cereal aisle and the frozen foods section. But I couldn't collapse because my children were at school expecting dinner. They expected their mother to be strong, to know things, to have answers. And I had nothing. Not a single answer in English. Not a single word that felt like mine. For the first 3 months after the separation, I barely left my apartment. My children would go to school, and I would sit on the floor of our tiny rental, surrounded by boxes I hadn't unpacked because I didn't know where to put things. Not because I was lazy, but because every decision felt monumental when I couldn't articulate it to anyone. I remember calling my mother back in Vietnam and trying to explain what had happened, but the words came out wrong. Not because my Vietnamese was failing me, but because I couldn't translate my American pain into a language that understood shame differently. In my culture, divorce is still whispered about. Still carries a weight of personal failure that suffocates. My mother kept saying, "Come home. Bring the children. We will figure it out." But I couldn't. I had invested too much. I had uprooted my entire existence for this marriage, for this country, for the promise of a better life that had crumbled into dust. And going back would mean admitting not just that my marriage failed, but that my immigrant dream failed. That I wasn't strong enough for America. That I had been naive to think a woman with B1 level English could survive alone with 2 young children in a country where even the weather feels aggressive in winter. The loneliness was unlike anything I had ever experienced. In my home country, I was surrounded by family, by neighbors who knew my grandmother, by a community that filled every silence with tea and gossip and unsolicited advice. Here, the silence was deafening. My neighbors waved but didn't visit. My children's teachers smiled but spoke too fast. The checkout lady at the supermarket would ask, paper or plastic? And I would freeze because my brain would start translating each word individually, missing the flow entirely. And by the time I understood the question, the line behind me had grown, and I felt the pressure of American impatience pressing against my back. I started going to the store at 7 a.m. just to avoid crowds. I started wearing headphones even when nothing was playing, just to create a barrier between me and the onslaught of English I couldn't process. I became invisible on purpose. I became the immigrant woman who didn't speak, who smiled apologetically, who nodded at everything and understood nothing. And somewhere beneath that forced smile, I began to hate myself. Not for the divorce, not for my husband's betrayal, but for my own silence. For my inability to defend myself, to explain myself, to even demand basic things like, please slow down, or can you repeat that? I had become a ghost in my own life, haunting the edges of conversations I couldn't enter. Watching my children's lives unfold in a language that separated us in ways I hadn't anticipated. My daughter, who was 8 at the time, started translating for me, not because I asked her to, but because she saw me struggling. She would take my hand at the doctor's office and say, "My mom needs an interpreter." She would tell her teacher, "My mom understands more than she speaks, but she's nervous." She was 8, and she was parentifying herself to rescue a mother who had stopped rescuing herself. And that was my breaking point. Not the divorce. Not the isolation. Not even the terrifying reality of being a single immigrant parent with limited English. It was watching my 8-year-old daughter become the adult in our relationship because I had let my fear of speaking English turn me into a helpless child. I remember locking myself in the bathroom one night after the kids went to bed, sitting on the cold tile floor, and crying so hard that I couldn't breathe. But somewhere between the sobs, a voice inside me said something that changed everything. It said, "You survived a marriage that was destroying you. You survived moving across the world. You survived culture shock, homesickness, and the brutal Ohio winter. And now you're telling me a language is going to defeat you? A language that billions of people speak? A language that children learn by simply existing near it?" It was an absurd thought, but it was a thought that carried a tiny spark of rebellion. I was not going to let English defeat me after everything else I had survived. I was not going to let my silence define my future or my children's perception of their mother. I was going to learn to speak, not because I wanted to, not because it was easy, but because not speaking was slowly killing me. So I started small. Embarrassingly small. I pulled out my phone and looked up the English word for bathroom. Then I repeated it out loud. Bathroom. 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 I looked at myself in the mirror, my face swollen from crying, and I said, "I am a woman. I am a mother. I am going to learn this language." It felt ridiculous. It felt like a motivational poster come to life. But it was also the first time in months that I had spoken English with any sense of agency. Not to order coffee, not to ask for directions, but to declare something to myself. And that declaration, as small and pathetic as it seemed, planted a seed. I didn't know it at the time, but that seed would grow into something that would rebuild my entire life. Not just my language skills, not just my confidence, but my sense of self. Because here's what I discovered in that bathroom, kneeling on cold tile with tears still wet on my cheeks. The divorce had taken my marriage, but I had let it take my voice too. I had let my ex-husband's departure convince me that I couldn't stand on my own. And that was a lie. A dangerous, self-reinforcing lie that had kept me small, silent, and invisible. The next morning, I did something terrifying. I walked to the community center near my apartment and asked in broken, halting English if they had any free English classes. The receptionist didn't laugh. She didn't look annoyed. She smiled warmly and handed me a flyer. And I couldn't even read the flyer because it was all English, but I didn't care. I had done something. I had taken a step. I had spoken to a stranger and survived. And that moment, right there in that fluorescent-lit community center hallway, was the first moment I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild myself from the wreckage of my marriage. Not quickly, not perfectly, not without fear. But maybe. And sometimes when you've lost everything, maybe is enough to keep you moving forward. That was the beginning of my divorce rebuilding me. That was the moment I stopped thinking of English as the language that defeated me and started thinking of it as the language that could set me free. Waking up in America, lost and silent. The first thing I noticed every morning was the silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence that feels like a gentle hug. No, this was the heavy, suffocating silence of a foreign country where even the birds sounded different. I would open my eyes in that tiny apartment in Columbus, Ohio, and for exactly 3 seconds, I would forget where I was. My brain would reach for the familiar sounds of home, the distant honking of motorbikes, the chatter of street vendors, the smell of pho drifting up from the kitchen below. But instead, I heard nothing. Nothing except the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere in the neighborhood. And then reality would crash into me like a wave of ice water. I was in America. My marriage was over. My children were sleeping in the next room, dreaming in a language I still couldn't fully understand. And I was about to face another day of not being able to say what I meant, not being able to defend myself. Not being able to even call the landlord to complain about the heating that barely worked in winter. Do you know what it feels like to wake up every day and realize that your voice has been taken away from you? Not by a physical illness, not by a cruel dictator, but by your own fear? I would lie in bed and mentally rehearse simple conversations. Good morning. How are you? I need milk. My child is sick. Can you help me? And by the time I actually faced a real person, my mind would go blank. The words would scatter like startled birds, and I would be left standing there with my mouth open, making sounds that weren't quite English and weren't quite Vietnamese either. Something in between. Something pathetic. Something that made people tilt their heads and squint and say, "I'm sorry, what?" And every single time that happened, a little piece of me died. Not dramatically. Not with fireworks or fanfare. Just a quiet, slow death of my self-esteem. I started to believe that I was stupid. That I wasn't capable of learning. That maybe I had reached some genetic limit, some ceiling on my intelligence that I couldn't break through. I knew, logically, that this wasn't true. I had graduated university with honors. I had run a small business back home. I had raised 2 children who were thriving in American schools. But logic doesn't matter when your brain is screaming at you that you're a failure. And so I started hiding, not just from other people, but from the English language itself. I would watch Vietnamese movies on my laptop with the volume low so the neighbors wouldn't hear. I would cook Vietnamese food and listen to Vietnamese music and pretend, for a few hours a day, that I hadn't left my country at all. But the illusion always shattered. My children would come home from school and start talking to me in English without even realizing it. They would ask for homework help and I would nod and smile and have no idea what they were asking. They would talk about their friends, their teachers, their favorite shows, and I would catch about 40% of what they said. The rest was noise. Beautiful, foreign noise that made me feel like an outsider in my own family. I remember one evening my son, who was 6 at the time, came home crying. He had been bullied at school because of his accent. The kids had called him weird because he pronounced certain words differently. And I couldn't defend him. I couldn't march into that school and demand justice because I couldn't articulate the problem in English. I couldn't even write a proper email. I sat there, watching my 6-year-old son sob, and I felt a rage so deep and so hot that I thought I would combust. But the rage wasn't directed at the bullies. It was directed at myself. For being so weak. For being so afraid. For letting my own language insecurity rob my child of a mother who could stand up for him. That night, after he fell asleep, I made a promise to myself. I would learn English. Not for me. Not for some abstract idea of self-improvement. But for him. For my daughter. For the 2 little humans who had been forced to grow up too fast because their mother couldn't speak the language of their new country. I started with the basics. I downloaded a language app and spent my children's nap time doing vocabulary exercises. I wrote down every new word on sticky notes and covered my apartment with them. Refrigerator. Counter. Sink. Stove. I would point at objects and say their names out loud, over and over, until my mouth got used to the foreign shapes. I practiced with my children, letting them correct me. Mom, it's vegetable, not vegetably. Mom, say friends, not friendies. And slowly, painfully slowly, I started to improve. But here's what I didn't expect. The more English I learned, the more I realized that language wasn't my real problem. The problem was my shame. The problem was the voice in my head that told me, before every conversation, you're going to mess this up. You're going to sound stupid. You're going to embarrass yourself. That voice was louder than any grammar rule. That voice was the real barrier. I realized that I had been carrying my failed marriage into every English conversation. My ex-husband had always been the English speaker in our relationship. He had handled the bills, the phone calls, the doctor's appointments. And when he left, he took that role with him. But he also left me with a deep belief that I couldn't function without him. That belief was a lie, but I had been living it for so long that it felt like truth. Every time I stumbled over a word, I heard his voice in my head. You can't even speak English properly. What are you doing here? And the worst part was, I believed him. So I decided to do something radical. I decided to stop apologizing for my English. I stopped starting conversations with sorry, my English is bad. I stopped shrinking when I made mistakes. I stopped treating every conversation like a test that I was destined to fail. And do you know what happened? People didn't run away screaming. People didn't laugh at me. In fact, most people were kind. They would slow down. They would rephrase things. They would nod encouragingly when I finally got a sentence right. And slowly I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the failure I thought I was. The day I realized this was the day I went to the DMV alone. If you've ever been to the DMV in America, you know it's a test of patience even for native speakers. For someone with limited English, it's a nightmare. But I went. I brought my documents. I practiced my lines in the car. Hello, I need to renew my driver's license. Here are my documents. Yes, I am a legal resident. And when I got to the counter, I said those words. Not perfectly. Not without pauses. But I said them. And the woman behind the counter didn't look at me with pity or frustration. She smiled and processed my application. And I walked out of that building feeling like I had just climbed a mountain. It was just the DMV. But for me, it was proof that I could survive in America without a translator, without a husband, without anyone holding my hand. From that day on, I started saying yes to things I used to avoid. I started answering the phone when unknown numbers called. I started going to parent-teacher conferences without bringing a translator. I made mistakes, of course. I mispronounced my own street address. I accidentally said, I'm pregnant, when I meant to say I'm frustrated. I mixed up beach and bitch in front of my elderly neighbor. But I laughed. I didn't die. And each mistake made me braver. Because here's the thing about shame. It thrives in secrecy. It grows in the dark corners of your mind where nobody else can see. But when you bring it into the light, when you make a mistake in public and realize that nobody cares as much as you do, it starts to shrink. It loses its power. And what you're left with is just you. Imperfect, flawed, but trying. And trying, it turns out, is enough. The mirror test. Do you remember the last time you truly looked at yourself in the mirror? Not the quick glance you do before leaving the house to check if your hair is okay, or if you have something stuck in your teeth. I mean, really looked, stared into your own eyes, and saw the person staring back at you. I avoided mirrors for months after my divorce. Not because I was afraid of my reflection, but because I was afraid of what I would see. A woman who had failed. A woman who had been abandoned. A woman who had come to America with big dreams and ended up with nothing but a broken heart and a dictionary she couldn't even use properly. But one morning something shifted. I was brushing my teeth, avoiding my own gaze as I always did, when my daughter walked in and said, "Mom, why don't you ever look at yourself?" It was such an innocent question, asked with the unfiltered honesty of a child, and it hit me like a brick. I put down my toothbrush, looked up, and for the first time in months, I really saw myself. And what I saw wasn't what I expected. I didn't see a failure. I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who had survived something terrible and was still standing.
Exhausted? Yes.
Scared? Absolutely. But standing. And in that moment, I realized I had two problems. A broken heart and a broken tongue. One was the result of my marriage ending. The other was the result of letting that ending convince me that I was powerless. But here's the thing about mirrors. They don't lie. They show you exactly what you are, not what you fear you are. And what I saw was a woman who was capable of so much more than she was giving herself credit for. I started talking to myself in the mirror. I know that sounds crazy, but stay with me. Every morning, I would look into my own eyes and say 3 sentences. In English. Slowly. Imperfectly. I am strong enough to learn this language. I am brave enough to make mistakes. I am worthy of being heard. The first week it felt ridiculous. I would cringe at my own accent, stumble over the words, and feel like a fool. But I kept doing it. Every single day. And something strange started to happen. The words started to feel less foreign. My reflection started to look less like a stranger, and more like someone I recognized. Someone I could trust. I realized that the problem wasn't my ability to learn English. The problem was that I had been treating myself like a student who was failing a test, instead of a human being who was learning to live again. I was so focused on getting the grammar right, on pronouncing every syllable perfectly, that I had forgotten the most important part of communication.
Connection.
Real human connection doesn't require perfect sentences. It requires presence. It requires courage. It requires you to show up and try, even when you're terrified of looking stupid. I remember a particularly difficult morning. I had a parent-teacher conference at my daughter's school, and I was dreading it. I had practiced my questions for hours. How's my daughter doing in math? Is she participating in class? Does she need extra help with anything? But when I sat down in that tiny chair across from the teacher, my mind went completely blank. My heart started racing. My palms started sweating. I could feel the familiar panic rising in my chest. And then I remembered what I had been practicing in the mirror. I took a deep breath, looked the teacher in the eye, and said, "I am learning English. Please be patient with me." And do you know what she did? She smiled warmly and said, "Of course. Take your time. We're on your side." That simple admission, that tiny act of vulnerability, changed everything. The conference went well. I didn't say everything perfectly. I mixed up a few words. I had to ask her to repeat herself twice. But I communicated. I connected. I left that school feeling like I had just won an Olympic medal. What I learned from that experience is that the fear of being judged is almost always worse than the judgment itself. We imagine people laughing at us, dismissing us, thinking less of us. But most people are kind. Most people are patient. And the ones who aren't? They don't matter. They're not your audience. You're not learning English for them. You're learning it for yourself. For your children. For the life you want to build in this new country. So I stopped caring about what strangers thought of my accent. I stopped apologizing for being a learner. I started showing up as my imperfect, authentic self. And the world didn't reject me. It welcomed me. I remember another moment that changed everything. I was at a coffee shop trying to order a latte. I had practiced the word latte over and over. But when I got to the counter, I froze. The barista asked me something I didn't understand. Something about whole milk, or oat milk, or almond milk. I had no idea what he was saying. I could feel the embarrassment creeping at my neck. But instead of running away, I did something different. I smiled and said, "I'm sorry. I'm still learning English. Can you say that again slowly?" And he did. He smiled, repeated the question slowly, and even pointed to the different milk options on the counter. I ordered my latte, paid, and left. But that moment stayed with me, because I had been honest about my limitations, and the world had responded with kindness. Not pity, kindness. And that's when I started to understand something essential about language learning. It's not about perfection. It's about connection. It's about being willing to look foolish in front of strangers so that you can eventually speak freely with people who matter. I started applying this lesson to every part of my life. When I went to the grocery store, I stopped pretending to understand things I didn't. I started asking questions. What is this vegetable called? How do you cook this? Is this organic? My questions were simple. My English was still broken, but I was communicating. I was learning. And with every interaction, my confidence grew a little more. I started to realize that the voice in my head, the one that told me I was stupid and incapable, was not the voice of reality. It was the echo of my ex-husband's criticism, the voice of a marriage that had taught me to doubt myself. And I could choose to listen to it, or I could choose to let it go.
So I let it go.
Not all at once. Not easily. But little by little, with every interaction, with every conversation, with every mistake I made and survived. I let go of the belief that I was too old to learn. I let go of the belief that I was too broken to improve. I let go of the belief that my accent would forever make me an outsider. And what replaced those beliefs was something I didn't expect. Freedom. The freedom to speak without fear. The freedom to make mistakes without shame. The freedom to be exactly who I was, a woman learning a new language in a new country, rebuilding her life from the ashes of a failed marriage. That's what the mirror taught me. That the face staring back at me was not the face of a failure. It was the face of a fighter. A woman who had survived the worst and was still here, still trying, still believing that something better was possible. And that belief, as fragile as it sometimes felt, was enough. It was enough to get me out of bed every morning. Enough to keep practicing. Enough to keep showing up, even when I wanted to hide. And slowly, imperceptibly, that belief started to transform not just my English, but my entire life. Why English felt like my enemy. Let me tell you something that might sound strange. I didn't hate English. I hated what English did to me. Every time I opened my mouth to speak, I felt like I was handing someone a weapon they could use against me. My accent became a target. My grammar mistakes became proof that I didn't belong. My pauses became evidence that I was slow, uneducated, somehow less than the people who had grown up with this language flowing through their veins like blood. And the worst part was, I didn't even realize I had made English my enemy until I started paying attention to how I felt before every conversation. My heart would race. My palms would sweat. My throat would tighten like it was preparing for a fight. Not a physical fight, of course, but a fight for dignity. A fight for respect. A fight to prove that I was more than the broken sentences that came out of my mouth. I remember standing in line at the post office, mentally rehearsing what I needed to say. I need to send a package to Vietnam. How much does it cost? How long will it take? I had practiced those sentences 50 times. But when I got to the counter, the clerk asked me something I hadn't prepared for. Is it documents or merchandise? I froze. My brain scrambled to translate the word merchandise, but it was too late. The clerk was already looking at me with impatience, and I could feel the eyes of the people behind me burning holes into my back. I muttered something incoherent, pointed at the package, and hoped it would be enough. It wasn't. The clerk asked again, slower this time, with a tone that made me feel like a child. And I wanted to disappear. I wanted to evaporate into thin air and never have to speak again. That was the moment I realized that English wasn't just a language to me. It was a reminder of everything I had lost. My confidence, my independence, my ability to be taken seriously. It was the language of my ex-husband's new life, the language of the lawyers who had handled our divorce, the language of a country that made me feel like an outsider every single day. But here's what I didn't understand at the time. English wasn't the enemy. My fear of English was the enemy. And that fear was fueled by something much deeper than a lack of vocabulary.
It was fueled by shame.
Shame about my divorce. Shame about my immigration status. Shame about being a single mother who couldn't even order a coffee without sweating. I was carrying so much shame into every conversation that I had no room left for learning. My brain was too busy protecting me from humiliation to absorb new information. It's actually a scientifically proven phenomenon. When you're in a state of high anxiety, your brain literally shuts down certain cognitive functions. The part of your brain responsible for memory and processing, the hippocampus, goes into survival mode. It stops storing new information and focuses on keeping you alive. So when I was standing in front of that post office clerk, terrified of being judged, my brain wasn't learning anything. It was just trying to survive. And that's why I kept making the same mistakes over and over again. Because I was so afraid of failing that I couldn't actually learn. I was stuck in a loop of anxiety and failure, and I didn't even know it. It took me a long time to understand this. I thought my problem was vocabulary. I thought if I just memorized enough words, everything would magically click into place. So I spent hours with flashcards, apps, and grammar books. I studied diligently. I worked harder than I had ever worked on anything, but my English barely improved. I was still freezing in conversations. I was still making the same mistakes. And I was starting to believe that maybe I was just one of those people who couldn't learn languages. Maybe I had hit my limit. Maybe I should just accept that I would always be the woman who nodded and smiled and understood nothing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Because there were moments when I was relaxed, when I was talking to my children, or to someone I trusted, when my English was actually pretty good. Not perfect, but good enough. I could express myself. I could joke. I could tell a story. So why did I freeze in front of strangers? Why did my mind go blank in stores, at the bank, at the doctor's office? It wasn't because I didn't know the words. It was because I was terrified. Terrified of being judged, of being dismissed, of confirming every negative stereotype about immigrants who can't speak English. I was so busy worrying about what other people thought of me that I forgot to actually communicate with them. I remember a particularly humiliating experience at my daughter's school. I had gone to pick her up early, and the office assistant asked me to sign her out. She handed me a form and said, "Please fill this out and sign at the bottom." I took the form, looked at it, and realized I didn't understand half of the words. Instead of asking for help, I pretended to understand. I wrote something in the wrong box. I signed in the wrong place. And when the assistant checked the form, she gave me a look that I will never forget. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even impatient. It was pity. That look of pity was worse than any anger could have been. It said, "You poor thing. You don't even understand a simple form." And I walked out of that office feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my entire life. That night, I locked myself in the bathroom and cried again. But this time, the tears weren't just sadness. They were rage. Rage at myself for being so afraid to ask for help. Rage at the situation that made me feel so powerless. And rage at the language that had become a symbol of everything I couldn't do. But somewhere in that rage, something shifted. I realized that I had been treating English like an enemy that I needed to defeat. And you can't learn from an enemy. You can't open yourself up to something you're fighting against. I had to make peace with English. I had to stop seeing it as a threat and start seeing it as a tool. A tool I could use to build a new life. A tool that could help me connect with my children's teachers, with my neighbors, with the community I wanted to be part of. And that shift in perspective changed everything. I stopped approaching conversations like battles. I stopped seeing every interaction as a test I might fail. I started treating English like what it really was. Just a language. Just a way to share thoughts and feelings with other humans. Not a measure of my worth. Not a reflection of my intelligence. Not a weapon that could be used against me. Just a language. And when I started thinking of it that way, something miraculous happened. The anxiety started to fade. The fear started to shrink. And in its place, curiosity grew. I started asking questions again. I started taking risks again. I started making mistakes on purpose, just to see what would happen. And what happened was that people responded with kindness. They laughed with me, not at me. They encouraged me. They taught me. And slowly, my enemy became my ally. My fear became my fuel. I also started to notice something important. The people I admired most, the ones who spoke English beautifully and confidently, they weren't perfect either. They made mistakes.
They paused.
They searched for words. They asked for clarification. The difference was, they didn't let those moments define them. They didn't shrink away from their imperfections. They leaned into them. And that's when I realized the secret to fluency. It wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about not caring when you do. It was about trusting that your imperfect English is still better than your perfect silence. It was about believing that you deserve to be heard, even when your words come out wrong. I started practicing this mindset everywhere I went. At the supermarket, I would ask the cashier about her day. At the park, I would chat with other parents. At the library, I would ask the librarian for book recommendations. Each conversation was a small victory. Each mistake was a lesson. And with every interaction, I was proving to myself that I was capable, that I was brave, that I was more than the sum of my grammatical errors. I started to see English not as a wall that separated me from the world, but as a bridge that could connect me to it. And once I made that mental switch, everything else started to fall into place. The quiet coffee shop. I found the coffee shop by accident. Or maybe it found me. I had been walking aimlessly through the streets of Columbus, trying to escape the suffocating silence of my apartment, when I turned a corner and saw it. A small, unassuming cafe tucked between a laundromat and a used bookstore. The sign above the door said The Daily Grind, and for some reason, I felt drawn to it. Maybe it was the warm glow of the lights inside. Maybe it was the sound of jazz music drifting through the half-open door. Or maybe it was just the desperate need to be somewhere that wasn't my tiny apartment, where the walls seemed to close in on me every night. I pushed open the door, and a little bell chimed above my head. The smell of fresh coffee hit me like a wave of comfort, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. I ordered a tea because I didn't know how to order coffee, and I found a small table in the corner, tucked away from the other customers. And I sat there, sipping my tea, listening to conversations I couldn't fully understand, and feeling strangely safe. Nobody was looking at me. Nobody was waiting for me to speak. Nobody was judging my accent or my grammar or my broken sentences. I was invisible, and for once, that felt like a gift. I started going back to that coffee shop every day, not to study, not to practice,
just to be.
I would bring a book or my notebook or sometimes nothing at all. I would sit in my corner and listen. I listened to the baristas taking orders. I listened to the customers chatting with each other. I listened to the rhythm of the language, the way the words flowed together, the way people emphasized certain sounds and softened others. I wasn't trying to understand everything. I was just letting the language wash over me like music. And slowly something started to shift. The sounds that had once felt so foreign started to feel familiar. The words that had once blurred together started to separate into distinct pieces. I started to recognize patterns, repetitions, common phrases that people used over and over again. Can I get a? I'll have the. How are you doing today? Have a good one. Simple phrases, repeated hundreds of times a day. And without even trying, without any flashcards or grammar drills, I started to absorb them. My brain was learning English in the background while I was just sitting there drinking tea, being a quiet observer. It reminded me of something I had read about language acquisition. Children don't learn languages by studying grammar books. They learn by being immersed in the language, by hearing it over and over again. By being surrounded by it in a low-pressure environment where they can just absorb it naturally. And that's exactly what was happening to me in that coffee shop. I was creating a low-pressure environment for my brain to do what it was designed to do. Learn without fear. Learn without judgment. Learn through curiosity and repetition and the simple joy of understanding something new. I started going to the coffee shop earlier in the morning, when it was quiet and empty. I would order my tea, sit in my corner, and listen. I would watch the baristas prepare drinks, noticing how they called out names and orders. I would watch the customers interact, noticing how they asked for things, how they made small talk, how they said goodbye. And I would repeat the phrases to myself under my breath when nobody was listening. Good morning. Can I have a latte? Thank you. Have a nice day. Over and over, until the words felt less foreign in my mouth. It was the first time I had practiced English without feeling anxious. The first time I had spoken the language without my heart racing. The first time I had felt like maybe, just maybe, I could do this. One day, something unexpected happened. The barista, a young woman with bright pink hair and a warm smile, called out my order and said, I see you here every day. You're a regular now. I froze. She was talking to me. She was waiting for a response. And I felt the familiar panic rising in my chest. But then I took a breath and remembered what I had been practicing. I smiled and said, Yes, I like your coffee shop. Very nice. Simple. Imperfect. But real. She smiled back and said, That's sweet. Where are you from? And I told her.
Vietnam.
I told her I was from Vietnam, and she asked me about the food, and I told her about pho and banh mi, and she said she had always wanted to visit. We had a conversation. A real conversation. Not long, not deep, but real. And I survived. I didn't freeze. I didn't run away. I just talked, made mistakes, and moved on. I left that coffee shop feeling like I had climbed another mountain. But this one was different. This one didn't feel like a battle. It felt like a connection. That coffee shop became my sanctuary. Every day I would go and practice my listening. I would pay attention to how people started conversations, how they ended them, how they expressed agreement or disagreement. I would notice the small phrases that native speakers used, the ones that weren't in textbooks. I'm good, you? Yeah, totally. No way. I started writing them down in a notebook I kept in my bag. Not to memorize them.
Just to notice them.
To train my ear to recognize them. And slowly, I started to feel more comfortable with the sounds of the language. The words that had once felt like a jumble of noise started to form into patterns. The sentences that had once felt like a wall started to reveal their structure. I was still far from fluent. I still made mistakes. I still had moments of panic when someone spoke too fast or used a word I didn't know. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Not the way I used to be. I had found a safe space to learn, a space where I could make mistakes without feeling ashamed, a space where I could be a beginner without being judged. And that changed everything. I started to realize that language learning isn't about memorizing endless lists of vocabulary or mastering every grammar rule. It's about creating an environment where your brain can do what it naturally does.
Absorb. Adapt.
Learn. And the best environment for learning is one where you feel safe, where you're not constantly worried about being judged, where you can take risks and make mistakes without feeling like a failure. That's what the coffee shop gave me. A safe space to be imperfect. A place where I could practice being a beginner without shame. And that's something I wish every English learner could have. A place where they can just be present, listen, and absorb the language without pressure. It might be a coffee shop or a library or a park bench. It doesn't matter where it is. What matters is that it's a place where you can lower your guard and let the language in. Because that's when the real learning happens. Not when you're forcing it. Not when you're afraid. But when you're relaxed, curious, and open to whatever comes next. A stranger said, "Good morning." I remember the exact morning it happened. It was a Tuesday, I think. The sky was gray, the way it often is in Ohio during autumn, and I was walking to the coffee shop with my head down, the way I always did, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. I had perfected the art of walking through the world without being seen. Eyes down. Shoulders hunched. A posture that screamed, "Please don't talk to me." And for the most part, it worked. People walked past me without a second glance. They didn't see me. They didn't notice me. And that was exactly how I wanted it. But on that Tuesday morning, something different happened. I was about to push open the door to the coffee shop when a man emerged from inside. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a kind face and a worn-out baseball cap. He held the door open for me, and as I passed by, he said something that stopped me in my tracks. "Good morning."
It was such a simple thing.
2 words. The kind of greeting that people exchange 100 times a day without thinking. But for me, it was a revelation. He wasn't asking me a question. He wasn't testing my English. He wasn't waiting for me to perform or prove myself. He was just greeting me, the way you greet a fellow human being. And for the first time in months, I felt seen. Not as an immigrant. Not as a woman who couldn't speak English. Not as a failure. Just as a person. A person who was worthy of a simple greeting. I smiled, and without even thinking, I said it back. "Good morning." The words came out naturally, without the familiar panic that usually accompanied my attempts to speak English. They just came out. And the man smiled, and went on his way. And I stood there, frozen in the doorway of the coffee shop, feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt human. That moment was a turning point for me. Not because I had suddenly learned a new word or mastered a grammar rule, but because I had been reminded of something essential. Language isn't just about exchanging information. It's about connection. It's about acknowledging each other's existence. It's about saying, "I see you. You're here. You matter." And in that simple exchange with a stranger, I had experienced that connection without fear, without anxiety, without the voice in my head telling me I wasn't good enough. I started to realize that I had been making English into something much more complicated than it needed to be. I was treating every conversation like a test, like a performance, like a moment where my entire worth as a human being was on the line. But that's not what language is. Language is just a tool for connecting with other people. And when you focus on the connection instead of the performance, everything becomes easier. The words start to flow. The fear starts to fade. And you start to remember that you're not just a language learner. You're a person with thoughts and feelings and a story to tell. I started to practice this new mindset everywhere I went. I would go to the park and say hello to the other parents. I would go to the grocery store and smile at the cashier. I would go to my children's school and greet the teachers with a simple good morning. Not because I had to, not because I was practicing, but because I genuinely wanted to connect with them. And slowly something shifted.
People started to recognize me.
They started to smile back. They started to engage with me, not as the woman who couldn't speak English, but as a neighbor, a parent, a member of the community. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was seen. And that feeling of being seen gave me the courage to speak more, to take more risks, to make more mistakes. Because I realized that even when I made mistakes, even when my English was broken, I was still a person who deserved to be heard. I remember one day at the grocery store, I was trying to find a specific ingredient for a Vietnamese dish I wanted to cook. I had been searching for it for weeks, but I didn't know what it was called in English. And I was too afraid to ask. Too afraid to sound stupid. But then I thought about that morning at the coffee shop. I thought about how it felt to be seen and greeted as a human being. And I decided to take a risk. I found a store employee, a young woman with a friendly face, and I said, "Excuse me, I'm looking for something. I don't know the name in English.
Can you help me?
She smiled and said, "Of course.
Tell me about it."
And so I did. I described the ingredient in my broken English, using words that probably didn't make much sense. But she listened. She asked questions. And together, we figured it out. She took me to the aisle and pointed to a jar that looked exactly right. It was the first time I had ever asked a stranger for help in English without feeling ashamed. And it worked. She didn't judge me.
She didn't laugh at me. She helped me.
And I left that grocery store feeling like I had just achieved something monumental. Not because I had found the ingredient, but because I had asked for help and been met with kindness. That's when I started to understand something important. The people around you are not your judges. They're not waiting for you to make a mistake so they can laugh at you. Most people are kind. Most people are patient. And the ones who aren't, they're the exception, not the rule. You don't need to impress everyone. You don't need to speak perfectly. You just need to show up, try your best, and trust that the world is generally a friendly place. It sounds naive, I know, but it's true. The fear of being judged is almost always worse than the judgment itself. And once you realize that, you're free. Free to speak. Free to make mistakes. Free to learn without shame. I started to apply this lesson to every part of my life. I started calling the phone company to ask about my bill. I started making appointments with the dentist. I started going to parent-teacher conferences without bringing a translator. Each of these experiences was scary at first. Each one made my heart race and my palms sweat. But each one also made me stronger. Each one proved to me that I was capable. And with each success, the fear shrank a little more. The voice in my head that told me I couldn't speak English got a little quieter. And the voice that told me I could do this got a little louder. One day, I realized something that surprised me. I was sitting at the coffee shop drinking my tea, and I noticed that I wasn't just listening to the conversations around me. I was understanding them. Not every word, of course, but enough. Enough to know what people were talking about. Enough to feel like I was part of the world instead of separate from it. And in that moment, I felt a surge of pride that I hadn't felt in a long time. I had come so far from that woman who couldn't even order a cup of tea without panicking. I was still learning. I was still making mistakes. But I was no longer afraid. And that was the most important transformation of all. Slowly, words started sticking. Something strange started happening around the third month of my daily coffee shop visits. I didn't notice it at first, It was subtle, like the way you don't notice the seasons changing until one day you realize the leaves have turned. But one morning I was sitting in my usual corner, sipping my tea, and I realized that I was understanding almost everything the barista was saying to the customer in front of me.
Not just the general idea.
Not just the gist. I was understanding the actual words, the specific phrases, the little jokes and asides that native speakers use without thinking. And I wasn't even trying. I wasn't straining to translate. I wasn't panicking. The words were just there, in my head, making sense. It was such a strange feeling that I almost laughed out loud. All those months of sitting in that coffee shop, just listening, just absorbing, and my brain had been doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It was learning, not through flashcards, not through grammar drills, but through sheer exposure, through repetition, through the simple act of being surrounded by the language until it stopped feeling foreign and started feeling familiar. It reminded me of something I had read about how babies learn their first language. They don't sit down with a textbook and study grammar rules. They just listen. They absorb. They make mistakes and try again. And eventually, without even realizing it, they start speaking. That's what was happening to me. I was learning English like a baby, slowly, organically, without the pressure of perfection. And it was working. I started to notice other changes too. I was no longer translating every word in my head before I spoke. The translation step was starting to disappear. Instead of hearing a question in English, translating it into Vietnamese, formulating my answer in Vietnamese, and translating it back into English. I was starting to think directly in English. Not all the time, of course. Not for complex thoughts or deep conversations. But for simple things, everyday things, my brain was starting to bypass the translation step altogether. The other day, someone asked me, "How are you?" And I responded, "I'm good, thanks," without even thinking about it. The words just came out. Naturally. Automatically. And I realized that this was the goal all along. Not to speak perfect English. Not to sound like a native speaker. But to speak without fear. To speak without translating. To speak the way you speak your first language, without overthinking every single word. It was a small victory, but it felt huge. I was no longer just surviving in English. I was starting to live in it. I remember a particularly memorable moment when this realization hit me. I was at the grocery store, and a woman asked me if I knew where the olive oil was. And I pointed to the aisle and said, "It's on aisle 3, near the pasta." It was such a simple exchange. Two strangers helping each other in a grocery store. But for me, it was everything. I hadn't rehearsed that sentence. I hadn't practiced it in my head. I hadn't translated it from Vietnamese. I just said it. And the woman understood me. She said thank you and went on her way. And I stood there in the middle of the grocery store, feeling a joy so pure and so unexpected that I almost cried. I had been so focused on all the things I couldn't do, all the things I couldn't say, all the mistakes I was making, that I had completely missed all the things I could do. I could help a stranger in a grocery store. I could give directions. I could answer a simple question without freezing. And that was something worth celebrating. I started keeping a journal. Not a fancy one, just a cheap notebook where I would write down the small victories. The moments when I had a successful conversation. The times when I made a mistake and laughed instead of crying. The words I had learned that week. Reading back through that journal, I could see my progress in a way that I couldn't see it day by day. Day by day, it felt like I wasn't improving. Day by day, it felt like I was making the same mistakes over and over again. But month by month, I could see the change. The sentences were getting longer. The vocabulary was getting richer. The confidence was growing. And that journal became a reminder that progress doesn't always feel like progress. Sometimes it feels like failure. Sometimes it feels like you're standing still. But if you look back, really look back, you can see how far you've come. And that perspective is everything. I also started to understand something important about the process of learning a language. It's not linear. It doesn't follow a straight line from beginner to fluent. It goes up and down. Some days you feel like you've made huge progress. Other days you feel like you're back to square one. Some days the words flow easily. Other days you can't remember the simplest vocabulary. And that's okay. That's normal. That's how learning works. It's not a smooth path. It's a winding road with lots of ups and downs. And the secret is to keep going, even on the bad days, even when you feel like you're not getting anywhere, because you are. Every single time you try, every single time you speak, even when you make mistakes, you are learning. Your brain is building new connections. Your ears are getting more attuned to the sounds of the language. Your mouth is getting more comfortable with the shapes of the words. It's happening, even when you don't feel it. I remember a day when I felt particularly discouraged. I had been practicing a specific phrase for weeks, and I still couldn't pronounce it correctly. I felt like a failure. I felt like giving up. And then my daughter came up to me and said, "Mom, your English is getting so much better. You used to not be able to say anything. Now you can have whole conversations." And that was all I needed to hear. Sometimes we're so focused on what we can't do that we forget to see what we can. I started to experiment with different ways of learning. I would watch TV shows in English with English subtitles, so I could see the words as I heard them. I would listen to podcasts while I was cooking just to get more exposure to the language. I would read children's books because the vocabulary was simple and the stories were engaging. And I would talk to myself. Yes, I know that sounds crazy, but I would narrate my day in English out loud when I was alone. I am making breakfast. I am going to the store. I need to buy milk and bread. It felt silly at first, but it helped. It helped my mouth get used to forming English words. It helped my brain get used to thinking in English. It helped me become more comfortable with the sound of my own voice in a foreign language. And slowly, words started to stick. New words that I had heard at the coffee shop would pop into my head when I needed them. Phrases that I had practiced in my journal would come out of my mouth without me even thinking about them. It was like my brain had finally started to believe that English was a language I could actually use. And once it believed that, everything else started to fall into place. I also learned to embrace my mistakes. Instead of cringing every time I made a grammatical error, I started to see each mistake as a learning opportunity. I would write down the correction. I would practice the correct version. And I would move on.
No jam.
No self-flagellation. Just learning. Because that's what mistakes are. They're not evidence that you're stupid. They're evidence that you're trying. And trying is the only way you'll ever improve. The people who never make mistakes are the people who never try. And I was done being one of those people. I was ready to try. I was ready to make mistakes. I was ready to learn. And that readiness, that willingness to be imperfect, was what finally set me free. So, if you're watching this and you're struggling with English, I want you to know something. It's okay to struggle. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to feel like you're not getting anywhere. Because you are. Every time you try, every time you speak, every time you listen, you are moving forward. Even when it doesn't feel like it. The words are sticking. Slowly, quietly, behind the scenes. And one day, you'll wake up and realize that English doesn't feel like a foreign language anymore. It feels like a part of you. My children became my teachers. I used to think that being a parent meant having all the answers. It meant being the strong one, the wise one, the one who knew what to do when things got hard. That's what my mother was to me. That's what I wanted to be for my children. But when my marriage fell apart, and my English failed me, I felt like I had failed as a mother. I couldn't help my children with their homework. I couldn't understand their report cards. I couldn't advocate for them at school. I was supposed to be their protector, their guide, their source of strength. But instead, I was the one who needed protection. I was the one who needed guidance. I was the one who couldn't even ask for an extra napkin at a restaurant. And that shame, that deep, gnawing shame, was almost worse than the pain of the divorce itself. I remember one evening, my daughter came home with a math worksheet that she couldn't understand. She came to me, as children do, expecting her mother to explain it. I looked at the worksheet and I couldn't read the instructions. They were in English, of course. Simple words, probably, but my brain was so fogged with anxiety that I couldn't make sense of them. I stared at the paper, my heart pounding, my palms sweating, and I felt the familiar wave of panic rising in my chest. My daughter looked at me with those big, trusting eyes, and I wanted to disappear. I wanted to vanish into thin air rather than admit that I couldn't help her. But something stopped me from lying. Something stopped me from pretending. I took a breath, looked at her, and said, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I don't understand this. Can you help me understand it?" And she did. She sat down next to me, pointed to the words, and explained the assignment in simpler English. Not because she was a genius, but because she was patient.
Because she loved me.
Because she wanted to help her mother the way her mother had always helped her. And in that moment, something shifted between us. We weren't just mother and daughter anymore. We were partners. We were learning together. And that feeling of partnership, of mutual support, was more powerful than any feeling of shame I had ever experienced. That was the beginning of a new chapter in my English journey. I stopped pretending to be the expert and started letting my children teach me. They were my teachers and they didn't even know it. Every day, they would come home from school and I would ask them what they had learned. Not the kind of question you ask to be polite. The kind of question you ask because you genuinely want to know. What did you learn in science today? What does that word mean? Can you teach me how to say that? And they would teach me. They would explain concepts in their simple, childlike language. They would correct my pronunciation gently. They would laugh when I made mistakes, but not in a mean way. In the way that children laugh because learning is fun, because mistakes are funny, because they have no concept of shame. And I started to realize that children are the best language teachers in the world. Not because they know everything, but because they don't judge. They don't care about grammar rules. They don't care about accents. They only care about communicating, about connecting, about being understood. And that's exactly what I needed. I started making learning a game. Every night at dinner, we would practice English together. I would tell them a sentence in Vietnamese, and they would translate it into English. Or they would say a sentence in English, and I would repeat it back, trying to get the pronunciation right. And they would correct me. "No, Mom, it's vegetable, not vegetably. Say it like this, Mom." I went to the store, and I would repeat it over and over until it sounded right. It was humbling to be corrected by my own children, but it was also liberating, because with them, there was no judgment. There was no impatience. There was only love and the shared joy of learning. They didn't see me as a failure. They saw me as their mother, someone who was brave enough to try, even when it was hard. And that gave me a strength I didn't know I had. I wanted to be worthy of their belief in me. I wanted to show them that learning never stops, that even adults can learn, that even when things are hard, you keep going. There was one moment that I will never forget. My son, who was 6 at the time, was teaching me a new word. It was a word he had learned in school, and he was so proud to teach it to me. He said it slowly, carefully, enunciating every syllable. Atmosphere. And I repeated it. Atmosphere. He shook his head.
No, ma'am.
You have to say it like this. Atmosphere. And I tried again.
And again.
And again. Until finally I got it right. And he looked at me with such pride, such joy, that I felt tears welling up in my eyes. He wasn't just teaching me a word. He was teaching me that I was capable, that I could learn, that I didn't have to be perfect to be loved. And in that moment, I realized that my children had become my greatest teachers. They had taught me the most important lesson of all. That language is not about perfection. It's about connection. It's about love. It's about two people sitting together, trying to understand each other. And if you have that, you have everything. I started to notice other ways my children were teaching me. They were teaching me about American culture. They would come home and tell me about what their friends were doing, what they were talking about, what was popular in school. They would teach me slang, the kind of language that doesn't appear in textbooks. Mom, it's lit not good. Mom, we say dope for cool. And I would laugh and repeat the words, feeling like I was getting a secret glimpse into a world I hadn't been a part of. They would teach me about holidays, about traditions, about the little quirks of American life that nobody tells you about. They became my cultural translators, explaining not just the language, but the context behind the language. Why Americans say bless you when you sneeze. Why they hold doors open for strangers. Why they tip at restaurants. These were things I never would have learned from a textbook. But I learned them from my children in the most natural way possible. Through daily life. Through conversation. Through love. I also started to see my children differently. I had always seen them as my responsibility, my dependents, the ones I had to protect and care for. But now I was seeing them as partners, as teachers, as collaborators in my journey. They had so much to offer me, so much to teach me, and I had been too proud to see it before. I had been so focused on being the perfect mother that I had missed the opportunity to let my children be my guides. And once I let go of that need to be perfect, once I admitted that I didn't have all the answers, our relationship transformed. We became closer. We laughed more. We shared more. And my English improved, not because I was studying harder, but because I was communicating more. Because I was connecting with the people I loved most in the world. And that connection, that deep, genuine connection, was the best language teacher I could ever have asked for. I realized that learning English wasn't just about me. It was about us. It was about building a life together in this new country. It was about showing my children that we could overcome anything as long as we did it together. And that realization gave me a purpose that went beyond vocabulary and grammar. It gave me a reason to keep going, even when things got hard. Because I wasn't just learning for myself anymore. I was learning for them. For my children who believed in me. For my children who needed me. For my children who had become my greatest teachers. Finding joy in mistakes. There was a time when every mistake I made in English felt like a small death. A little piece of me would wither every time I mispronounced a word or used the wrong tense or mixed up two similar sounding phrases. I would replay the moment in my head for days, cringing at my own incompetence, convinced that everyone who heard me was secretly laughing at me. I carried the weight of every error like a stone in my pocket, collecting them, polishing them, holding them up as evidence of my failure. It was exhausting. It was demoralizing. And it was completely unnecessary. Because here's the thing about mistakes that I didn't understand at the time. They're not evidence of failure. They're evidence of trying. They're evidence of growth. They're the fingerprints of a person who is brave enough to speak, even when they're not perfect. And once I started to see them that way, everything changed. I remember the exact moment when my relationship with mistakes shifted. I was at the coffee shop, ordering my usual tea, and I tried to say something about the weather. I had been practicing a new phrase, "It's a bit chilly today," but what came out of my mouth was, "It's a bit silly today." The barista looked at me with a confused expression, and I felt the familiar panic rising. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of apologizing profusely and shrinking away, I laughed. I laughed at my own mistake. And the barista, seeing me laugh, started laughing too. We stood there, two strangers in a coffee shop, laughing together at my mispronunciation. And in that moment, the mistake became not a source of shame, but a source of connection. It was a moment of shared humanity. It was a reminder that we're all imperfect, all a little silly sometimes, and that imperfection is nothing to be ashamed of. It's something to be celebrated, because it's proof that we're alive, that we're trying, that we're growing, and that's a beautiful thing. From that day on, I started to actively look for the humor in my mistakes. I would keep a list of my funniest errors, not to mock myself, but to remind myself that language learning is a journey filled with hilarious detours. I once told my neighbor that I was excited to eat my children, instead of excited to eat with my children. I once told a store clerk that I was very horny, instead of very hungry. I once asked a librarian for a book about ships, and she handed me a book about sheep. These moments could have been devastating. They could have sent me into a spiral of shame and self-doubt. But instead, I chose to see them as stories. Funny stories that I could tell my children. Funny stories that I could share with other language learners. Funny stories that reminded me that language is not a test to be passed, but a playground to be explored. And once I started seeing it as a playground, the fear started to dissolve. The pressure started to lift. And the joy started to flow. I started to notice something interesting about the people around me. The native English speakers I admired the most weren't the ones who never made mistakes. They were the ones who didn't care about making mistakes. They were the ones who spoke freely, confidently, without constantly monitoring themselves for errors. They were the ones who understood that communication is more important than perfection. And I realized that I wanted to be like them. Not because I wanted to speak perfect English, but because I wanted to be free. I wanted to speak without fear. I wanted to connect without anxiety. I wanted to laugh at my own mistakes instead of crying over them. And that realization was liberating. It was permission to be human. Permission to be imperfect. Permission to learn at my own pace, without the weight of unrealistic expectations. I started to experiment with making mistakes on purpose. I would intentionally use the wrong word just to see what would happen. I would deliberately mispronounce something, just to practice recovering from the error. It sounds strange, I know, but it was a way of desensitizing myself to the fear of being wrong. It was a way of proving to myself that mistakes are not the end of the world. That even if I say something completely ridiculous, people will still understand me, or they'll laugh with me, or they'll ask for clarification.
But they won't reject me.
They won't think less of me, because I am not defined by my grammatical errors. I am defined by my willingness to try. And once I truly internalized that, my English started to improve faster than it ever had before. Not because I was studying harder, but because I was relaxing. Because I was letting go of the fear that had been holding me back. Because I was allowing myself to be imperfect. And in that imperfection, I found a kind of freedom that I had never experienced before. I also started to notice that my mistakes were actually helping me learn. Every time I made an error and got corrected, I was more likely to remember the correction. The embarrassment of the moment made the lesson stick. It was like my brain was saying, okay, we don't want to feel that way again, so let's remember the right way to say it. And I did remember. I remembered the corrections. I remembered the right words. And slowly, my mistakes became fewer and farther between. Not because I was avoiding them, but because I was learning from them. I was turning my failures into fuel. And that fuel was propelling me forward faster than I ever could have imagined. I remember a particularly wonderful moment when I realized how far I had come. I was at a party with some other parents from my children's school. It was a potluck, and everyone was sharing food and stories. I was sitting in a group of people, all native English speakers, and we were having a conversation. Not a simple conversation about the weather. A real, deep conversation about life, about parenting, about our hopes and fears. And I was participating. I was contributing. I was expressing my thoughts and feelings in English without translating everything in my head. I made mistakes, of course. I stumbled over a few words. I mixed up a couple of tenses, but nobody cared.
They were listening to me.
They were responding to me. They were connecting with me. And I realized, with a shock of joy, that I was no longer the woman who sat in the corner, silent and invisible. I was a member of the community. I had something to say, and people wanted to hear it. That moment, sitting in that circle of friends, laughing and talking and sharing, was the moment I knew I had truly arrived. Not because my English was perfect. It wasn't. Not because I had stopped making mistakes. I hadn't. But because I had finally found joy in the process. I had finally stopped treating my mistakes as enemies and started treating them as teachers. I had finally stopped fearing the language and started embracing it. And in that embrace, I found something I hadn't expected. I found myself. So, if you're watching this and you're struggling with English, I want to encourage you. Don't be afraid of your mistakes. Celebrate them. Laugh at them. Learn from them. Because every mistake you make is proof that you're trying. And trying is the only way you'll ever improve. You are not your errors. You are not your accent. You are not your grammatical mistakes. You are a person who is brave enough to learn a new language. And that makes you extraordinary. So go ahead. Make mistakes. Make a lot of them. And laugh while you're doing it. Because that laughter, that joy, that willingness to be imperfect is what will set you free. And freedom, more than fluency, is the real goal of language learning. A date that changed everything. I had convinced myself that love was no longer for me. After the divorce, after the years of feeling broken and invisible, I had built walls around my heart so high and so thick that I couldn't imagine anyone ever climbing over them. I told myself I was too old, too damaged, too busy with my children and my English and my survival to even think about romance. But the universe, as it often does, had other plans. It happened at the library, of all places. I had started volunteering there on weekends, partly to practice my English and partly to feel useful. I was helping to organize a children's story time when I noticed a man sitting in the corner, reading a book and smiling to himself. He had kind eyes and a gentle smile, and something about him made me feel safe. I didn't think much of it at first. I was too focused on my task, too focused on not making mistakes, to pay attention to a stranger. But then he looked up, caught my eye, and smiled. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A flutter, a spark, a tiny, terrifying flicker of hope. I looked away quickly, embarrassed, and went back to my work. But I couldn't stop thinking about him, about his smile, about the way he had looked at me, not with pity, not with judgment, but with warmth. And I realized, with a jolt of surprise, that I wanted to talk to him. Not because I was looking for love, not because I needed someone to save me, but because I wanted to connect with another human being. I wanted to see if I could still do that. I wanted to see if I was still capable of being seen. The next weekend, he was there again. Same corner, same book, same smile. And this time I made a decision. I would say something. I would take a risk. I would speak to him in my broken English and see what happened. I walked over to his table, my heart pounding in my chest, my palms sweating. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The familiar panic was rising, the fear of being judged, the fear of sounding stupid. But then I remembered everything I had learned. I remembered that mistakes are not the end of the world. I remembered that connection is more important than perfection. And I took a breath and said, I see you here every weekend. You must really like books. The words came out slowly, haltingly, with a few mispronunciations. But they came out. And he looked up at me, his smile widening, and said, I do. But I come here for the story time. I like watching the children listen. I was surprised. He wasn't just a random book reader. He was a kindred spirit, someone who appreciated the simple things, someone who saw the beauty in small moments. And just like that, the conversation began. We talked about books, about children, about our lives. He told me he was a widower. His wife had passed away 5 years ago, and he had been trying to find his way back to joy. I told him about my divorce, about my children, about my struggle with English. And he didn't flinch. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with understanding. He said, You're brave. You're learning a new language. You're building a new life. That takes courage. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. Not as a victim. Not as a failure. As a survivor. As a fighter. As a woman who is worthy of love. We started meeting at the library every weekend. Then we started meeting for coffee. Then we started meeting for dinner. Each time, I was terrified. Each time, I made mistakes. I mixed up words. I mispronounced things. I said, I am boring when I meant, I am bored. I said, I am full of soup when I meant, I am full after the soup.
And each time he laughed. Not at me.
With me. He would gently correct me, not in a condescending way, but in a way that felt like a gift. It's I am bored, not I am boring. You're not boring. You're the most interesting person I know. And I would blush and repeat the correction, and we would move on. He never made me feel ashamed of my English. He never made me feel like I was less than him because I couldn't speak perfectly. He just accepted me as I was. Broken sentences and all. And that acceptance, that unconditional acceptance, was the most healing thing I had ever experienced. It was proof that I didn't need to be perfect to be loved. It was proof that I was enough, exactly as I was. One evening, we were sitting in a restaurant, and I was trying to tell him a story about my childhood. It was a complex story, with lots of details and emotions, and I was struggling to find the right words. I kept pausing, searching for vocabulary, making mistakes. And he just sat there, listening patiently, nodding encouragingly. When I finally finished, he looked at me and said, Your English is beautiful. Not because it's perfect, but because it's yours. Every word you speak is a word you fought for, and that makes it more valuable than any native speaker's words. And I started to cry. Not from sadness. From gratitude. Because for the first time in my life, someone had made me feel like my imperfect English was something to be proud of, not something to be ashamed of. I realized that I had been so focused on all the things I couldn't say, all the mistakes I was making, that I had completely missed the fact that I was communicating. I was connecting. I was being understood. And that was the whole point. Our relationship grew slowly, gently, like a flower blooming in the spring. He was patient. He was kind. He was everything I had never dared to hope for. And with him, my English continued to improve. Not because he was teaching me, but because he was creating a safe space for me to practice. I could make mistakes without fear. I could ask questions without shame. I could express myself without worrying about being judged. And in that safe space, my confidence grew. My vocabulary expanded. My accent softened. I was becoming more fluent, not because I was studying harder, but because I was finally relaxing. I was finally letting go of the fear that had held me back for so long. And the person who helped me do that was a kind man with a gentle smile and a love for books. I remember the night he told me he loved me. It was a simple moment, not a grand romantic gesture. We were sitting on a park bench, watching the sunset, and he turned to me and said, "I love you." And I froze. Not because I didn't feel the same way. I did. I had fallen in love with him weeks ago, but I didn't know how to say it back in English. I was afraid of getting the words wrong. I was afraid of ruining the moment. But then I looked into his eyes, and I saw the same fear, the same vulnerability reflected back at me. And I realized that love transcends language. It transcends grammar. It transcends pronunciation. It transcends every mistake I could ever make. So I took a breath and said the words, exactly as I had practiced them in my head 1,000 times. I love you too. Simple. Imperfect. Perfect. And he kissed me, and the world melted away. And in that moment, I knew that I had finally healed, not because I had found love, but because I had found the courage to be loved. I had found the courage to be seen with all my imperfections and to trust that I was enough. My children met him a few weeks later. I was terrified. What if they didn't like him? What if they felt like he was replacing their father? What if my English wasn't good enough to explain this new chapter in our lives? But my fears were unfounded. My children adored him. He was patient with them, kind, funny. He played games with my son. He helped my daughter with her homework. He was the father figure they had been missing, not because he was replacing their dad, but because he was adding something new to their lives. And my children, in their innocent wisdom, accepted him without reservation. They didn't care about his accent or his background or any of the things that adults worry about. They just cared about how he made them feel. And he made them feel loved. And that was enough. Our relationship grew deeper, stronger, more beautiful with each passing day. We talked about everything. Our hopes, our fears, our dreams. And my English continued to improve, not because I was trying so hard, but because I was finally living in the language. I was no longer a student of English. I was a speaker of English. I was a lover in English. I was a mother in English. I was a friend in English. The language had become a part of me, not through force, but through love. And that love, that beautiful, unexpected love, had healed me in ways I never thought possible. So if you're watching this and you're struggling with English, I want you to know something. Love can find you even in the most unexpected places. Even when you're broken. Even when you're afraid. Even when your English is imperfect. You don't need to be fluent to be loved. You just need to be brave enough to try. Brave enough to show up. Brave enough to let yourself be seen. Because the people who matter, the people who truly see you, will love you for exactly who you are. Broken sentences and all. And that love, that unconditional acceptance, might just be the thing that sets you free. From surviving to living. The day I realized I had stopped surviving and started living was not a dramatic one. There were no fireworks, no grand declarations, no moment of sudden clarity that changed everything. It was a Tuesday. A completely ordinary Tuesday. I was making breakfast in my tiny apartment, the sun streaming through the window, my children laughing at the table, and my partner sitting across from me, reading the newspaper and smiling. And I realized with a shock of joy that I was happy. Not the kind of happy that comes from a special occasion or a big achievement, The kind of happy that comes from ordinary moments, from simple routines, from the quiet knowledge that you are exactly where you belong. I had spent so many months just trying to survive, just trying to get through the day, just trying to keep my head above water. Survival had been my only goal, and I had been so focused on surviving that I had forgotten what it felt like to actually live. But that morning, standing in my kitchen, surrounded by the people I loved, I realized that I was no longer just surviving. I was living. I was truly, deeply, joyfully living. And it was the most beautiful feeling I had ever experienced. It wasn't that my problems had disappeared. I still had challenges. I still struggled with English sometimes. I still had moments of doubt and insecurity. I still worried about my children, about money, about the future. But those worries no longer consumed me. They no longer defined me. I had learned to hold them lightly, to acknowledge them without letting them take over. Because I had also learned something essential. Life is not about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. And I had finally learned to dance. Not perfectly. Not gracefully.
but joyfully.
And that made all the difference. My English had improved significantly by this point, but it was still imperfect.
I still made mistakes.
I still had an accent. I still sometimes froze when someone spoke too fast or used a word I didn't know. But I no longer let those moments define me. I no longer saw them as evidence of failure. I saw them as part of the journey, as reminders that I was still learning, still growing, still becoming.
And there was something beautiful about that.
There was something beautiful about being a work in progress, because it meant I hadn't stopped. It meant I was still moving forward. It meant I was still alive. I started to notice how much my relationship with English had changed. It was no longer the enemy I had to defeat. It was the tool I used to build my new life. I used it to connect with my partner, to communicate with my children's teachers, to make friends in my community. I used it to express my thoughts and feelings, to share my story, to make myself heard. And the more I used it, the more it became a part of me. Not something I had to struggle with, but something I could simply inhabit. It was like learning to ride a bike. At first, it was terrifying. Every pedal felt like a risk. Every wobble felt like a disaster. But eventually, without even noticing, you stop thinking about it. You just ride. And that's where I was with English.
I had stopped thinking about it.
I was just speaking, just connecting,
Just living.
I remember a conversation I had with my partner about this. I told him that I used to see English as a wall between me and the world. A wall that I had to climb, brick by painful brick.
But now I saw it as a bridge.
A bridge that connected me to people, to opportunities, to a life I had never dreamed possible. And he said something that stayed with me. He said, "You didn't just learn English. You built a new self."
And he was right.
The woman who had arrived in America, broken and silent, was not the woman I was now. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up. Not just my English. My identity. My confidence. My sense of purpose. And that rebuilding had been painful, yes. But it had also been deeply transformative. I had become someone I was proud of. Someone who could face challenges with courage. Someone who could make mistakes and laugh. Someone who could love and be loved. Someone who could live, not just survive. My children had noticed the change too. They told me I smiled more. They told me I laughed more. They told me I seemed lighter, happier, more present. And they were right. I had spent so many months carrying the weight of my divorce, the weight of my silence, the weight of my fear. But I had finally put that weight down. I had finally let go of the shame that had been holding me back. And in doing so, I had made room for joy, for connection, for the simple, beautiful moments that make life worth living. I also started to give back. I started volunteering at the community center, helping other immigrants learn English. Not as a teacher because I didn't feel qualified, but as a mentor, as someone who had been where they were, as someone who understood their fear, their shame, their struggle. I would sit with them, listen to their stories, and share my own. I would tell them about the coffee shop, about the mirror, about the stranger who said good morning. I would tell them that it gets easier, that the fear doesn't disappear, but it becomes manageable, that the mistakes don't stop, but they become funny, that the journey is hard, but it's worth it. And watching them take their first steps, watching them find their own courage, was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. It reminded me of how far I had come. It reminded me that we are all connected, all struggling, all trying to find our way. And that connection, that shared humanity, is what makes everything worthwhile. I remember one woman who came to the community center, barely able to say her name in English. She was terrified. Her eyes were filled with the same fear I had felt. And I sat with her, just like my children had sat with me, and I said, "You are braver than you know. You are stronger than you think. And you are not alone." And over the weeks and months, I watched her transform. I watched her confidence grow. I watched her English improve. And I felt a deep, profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. The divorce, the pain, the struggle. It had all been worth it, because it had made me who I was. A woman who could help others. A woman who could inspire others. A woman who had learned that survival is not the goal. Living is the goal. And living, truly living, is a choice we make every single day. I started to think differently about the future. Before, the future had been something I feared. Something uncertain. Something I had to survive. But now, the future was something I looked forward to. Something I was excited about. Something I was building step by step. I had plans. I had dreams. I had goals. Not just for my English, but for my life. I wanted to travel. I wanted to write. I wanted to keep learning, keep growing, keep becoming. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I could do all of those things. Not because I was perfect. Not because I had all the answers. But because I had something more important. I had courage. I had resilience. I had the willingness to try, to fail, and to try again. And that was enough. That was more than enough. I also started to realize that living, truly living, meant embracing all of who I was. My Vietnamese heritage. My American life. My broken English. My imperfect past. They all had shaped me into who I was. And I was proud of that person. Not despite her imperfections, but because of them. Because they were evidence of her journey. Evidence of her strength. Evidence of her refusal to give up. And there was nothing more beautiful than that. Divorce rebuilt me, and English gave me wings. I never thought I would say this, but I am grateful for my divorce. Not because it was easy. Not because it didn't hurt. But because it broke me open in a way that allowed me to rebuild myself into someone I actually like. Someone I'm proud of. Someone who can stand on her own 2 feet and say, I did this. I survived. I thrived. The divorce took everything from me. My marriage, my identity, my sense of security. But in doing so, it also gave me something priceless. It gave me the opportunity to discover who I was without anyone else defining me. It gave me the chance to build a life that was truly mine. And that life, as imperfect and challenging as it is infinitely better than anything I could have imagined back when I was still married, still silent, still hiding behind someone else's words. I used to think that my ex-husband was my strength, that without him, I was nothing. But now I know the truth.
He was not my strength. He was my crutch.
And when that crutch was taken away, I had no choice but to learn how to walk on my own. And walk I did. Not perfectly. Not without stumbling. But I walked. And every step made me stronger.
Every stumble taught me something.
Every fall reminded me that I could get back up. And getting back up, over and over again, was what built the woman I am today. My relationship with English was a huge part of that rebuilding. Learning English wasn't just about acquiring a new skill. It was about reclaiming my voice. It was about proving to myself that I could communicate, that I could connect, that I could be heard. Every word I learned was a brick in the foundation of my new identity. Every mistake I made was a lesson in humility. Every conversation I had was a step toward freedom. And that freedom, that ability to express myself without fear, was the greatest gift the language ever gave me. But the language didn't give it to me. I gave it to myself. I was the one who showed up every day, who practiced even when I felt like giving up, who faced my fears and conquered them. English was just the tool. I was the builder. And I built something beautiful. A new life. A new identity. A new sense of self. My children were part of that building process too. They were my teachers, my cheerleaders, my reason for keep going. They watched me struggle, and they watched me succeed. They saw me fall, and they saw me get back up. And in doing so, they learned something invaluable. They learned that resilience is possible, that failure is not the end, that growth is always within reach. And that lesson, more than any English word I could ever teach them, is the greatest gift I will ever give them. They now have a mother who is strong, who is brave, who is not afraid to be imperfect. They have a mother who shows them that life is not about avoiding challenges. It's about facing them head on and growing through them. And that's a lesson that will serve them for the rest of their lives. My partner, the kind man I met at the library, has also been a part of my journey. Not as a savior, not as a crutch, but as a witness. Someone who saw me at my worst and loved me anyway. Someone who saw me struggling and believed in me anyway. Someone who saw my imperfect English and heard my imperfect heart and chose to love me anyway. And that love, that unconditional, accepting love, has been a healing balm for wounds I didn't even know I had. It has shown me that I am worthy of love, not because I am perfect, but because I am me. And being me, with all my flaws and mistakes and broken sentences, is enough. It is more than enough. Looking back, I realized that the journey was never really about learning English. It was about learning myself. It was about discovering that I was stronger than I thought, braver than I believed, and more capable than I ever imagined. It was about learning to trust myself, to believe in myself, to love myself. And that self-love, that deep, unshakable belief in my own worth, is what has carried me through everything. It's what got me through the divorce. It's what got me through the fear of speaking. It's what got me through the loneliness and the shame and the doubt. And it's what will carry me through whatever comes next. Because I know now that I can handle anything. Not because I am invincible, but because I am resilient. And resilience is not about never falling. It's about always getting back up. I also learned something about forgiveness. I forgave my ex-husband, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved peace. Holding on to anger and resentment was like drinking poison and expecting him to die. It was hurting me, not him. And I had already been hurt enough. So I let it go. Not all at once. Not easily. But slowly, over time, I released the bitterness that had been weighing me down. And in doing so, I made room for joy. For love.
For the beautiful life I have now.
Forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself. And I finally freed myself. I also forgave myself for the mistakes I made, for the years I spent silent, for the times I felt like a failure. I forgave myself for not being perfect, for not being fluent, for not being the mother I thought I should be. And that self-forgiveness, that release of self-judgment, was the most liberating thing I have ever done. It allowed me to move forward without the weight of shame dragging me down. It allowed me to embrace my imperfections and see them as part of my story, not as evidence of my inadequacy. The woman I am today is not the woman who arrived in America all those years ago. That woman was scared, broken, and silent. This woman is brave, whole, and outspoken. This woman can speak English. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but confidently. This woman can stand up for herself, advocate for her children, and connect with people from all walks of life. This woman has a partner who loves her, children who admire her, and a community that values her. This woman has built a life from nothing and turned it into something beautiful. And this woman is me. I built her, brick by brick, word by word, mistake by mistake. I built her with every moment of courage, every act of defiance, every refusal to give up. And I am so incredibly proud of her. So if you're watching this and you're struggling with English or with divorce or with any of the other challenges that life throws at you, I want you to know something. You are capable of more than you think. You are stronger than you believe. And you are worthy of all the love and happiness that life has to offer. Don't let fear hold you back. Don't let shame silence you. Don't let failure define you. Keep going. Keep trying. Keep believing in yourself. Because the person you are becoming, the person you are building through all of the struggle, is someone truly extraordinary. And one day, you will look back at this moment and realize that it was the moment everything changed. The moment you stopped surviving and started living. The moment you found your voice and used it. The moment you became exactly who you were meant to be. That's what divorce did for me. It didn't break me. It rebuilt me. And English was the tool I used to do it. Not the tool that made me fluent, but the tool that made me free. And freedom, in the end, is the only thing that matters. Not perfection. Not fluency. Not the ability to sound like a native speaker. But the ability to be yourself. To express yourself, to live your life on your own terms. That's what I found. And that's what I wish for every single person watching this video. The courage to rebuild, the determination to keep going, and the freedom to be exactly who you are. The divorce didn't break me. It broke open the version of me that was too afraid to speak, too afraid to try, too afraid to live. And in that breaking, I found something I never expected. I found myself. I found my voice. I found a language that didn't just teach me new words, but taught me who I really am. And now, I'm not just surviving in English. I'm thriving in it. I'm laughing in it. I'm loving in it. I'm living in it. But here's the thing. This story isn't really about me. It's about you. The person watching this video right now, wondering if you'll ever get there. Wondering if you'll ever stop translating in your head. Wondering if you'll ever feel confident enough to speak without fear. I'm here to tell you, you will. Not because it's easy. Not because it happens overnight. But because you are braver than you know. And because every single time you try, even when you fail, you're one step closer to the person you are becoming. So, here's my challenge to you. Don't just watch this video and move on. Take one action today. One small, imperfect, brave action. Say hello to a stranger. Ask a question in English. Make a mistake and laugh about it. Write a comment below telling us one thing you're struggling with or one victory you've had this week. Let's build a community of people who are not afraid to be imperfect. People who are learning, growing, and showing up for themselves every single day. If this story touched you, if it gave you hope or courage or a reason to keep going, then do 3 things for me. First, subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story that could change your perspective. Second, hit the notification bell so you're the first to know when we release our next video. And third, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who is struggling. Someone who feels alone. Someone who needs to know that they are not the only one fighting this battle. Because the truth is, we're all fighting something. And the people who win are not the ones who never struggle. They're the ones who keep going anyway. They're the ones who show up, even when it's hard. They're the ones who refuse to let their fear define them. You are one of those people. I know it. And I can't wait to see the story you're about to write. Until next time, keep speaking.
Keep making mistakes.
Keep growing. And never, ever forget that your voice matters. Broken sentences and all.
Subscribe now.
Your future self will thank you.